Okay, so let's now do some hands-on demos and discussion. So let me ask you, what are the major features in project that come to mind for you when I say, hey, given the context of that project triangle model, what are those features that really focus on time as distinct from cost and scope? And there are many of them in project, as we would expect. Absolutely. The Gantt chart view itself has a prominent bias to represent time. That's the real breakthrough of the visualization of the Gantt chart view is the timeline, isn't it? Showing work over time. That essentially is the primary visualization associated with project management. Yeah. So any of the Gantt views have a very strong prominence on time. Critical path. So let me ask you this. Who's ever heard the term critical path misused? Because I think we know the technical meaning. So I have this little game I play at work. It's this little mental drinking game where when I hear somebody say, you're on the critical path, or this is now a critical path, and I press them what they mean, they never mean the technical meaning. And of course, we know the technical meaning is that sequence of activities that is driving the finish date of the project. That is all critical path means. Now, if we're focused on time, especially time of the overall project, we probably should care a great deal about finding and managing the critical path. Because by definition, that sequence of activities is setting the finish date of my project. Other features people can think of? These are all right on track.
Resource assignments?
So I might care about resource assignments in terms of what?
How much they're on allocated?
Yeah, allocation, availability, over allocation. So if anyone here has used the awesome level resources feature and you didn't like the end result because it pushed out your project finish date, it was solving a time problem, wasn't it? Right? It was properly allocating resources, which required more time than you would like to give to those resources. So yeah, I would say that's a fair time-related feature as well. I'm going to show you the list I came up with, and then we'll jump into project and do some hands-on work. So first of all, I mentioned baseline. Although as we said, the Gantt chart view has the objective timeline, an actual calendar. That only answers part of the question related to time. So the Gantt chart timeline tells me, hey, when does this work occur on a calendar? Right? But what baseline helps me answer is, hey, when does this work now, I should say, when is this work now scheduled to occur in relation to when I at some time in the past thought it would occur and captured in a baseline? That's a different question, right? So I always want to mention baseline because that becomes essential to not just time, but other aspects of the model that we build in project. Deadline date, simple little feature, but boy, it can save you a lot of trouble that you otherwise may encounter, and we'll demo that as well. Of course, critical path we mentioned. I say appropriate constraints applied to tasks because what I observe is often people are trying to solve time-related problems, and when you get down to the root cause issue, they have applied hard constraints or inflexible constraints to tasks that did not really require them. It's not difficult to do in project.
Yeah, unknowingly to properly do that, right?
Sorry?
Unknowingly.
Oh, and Bill points out they unknowingly applied those constraints. That's why I say appropriate constraints. Sometimes a must finish on constraint is exactly the right kind of constraint to apply, but you really want to do that intentionally. Right? Okay. It's better now in project than it used to be, in terms of inadvertently applying inflexible constraints. Sorting and filtering of tables, we're going to demo that. There's a lot of great capability there, and especially if you're coming from an Excel background and you're just used to being able to manipulate tabular data that way, you can do quite a bit with time-based values there. The project info statistics, a dialog box. I use this all the time because it's just a handy snapshot for some of this key project level data that we'll be interested in. Okay, and then finally I mentioned task 0 or the project summary task. I mentioned that for two reasons. One, it's off by default in project. And two, it's kind of hard to find where you turn it on. I always forget and I have to hunt around for it. And then when I find it, I say, that's weird that it's located where it is. But it's really useful because it gives you aggregate time values it's one of the easiest ways at a glance to see overall project duration and other aggregate values rolled up to the project level. Some of the specific views and tables we'll look at, of course, the timeline, major new feature introduced in 2010. Nice focus on time, hides a lot of the complexity that the Gantt chart view does, that includes. All Gantt chart views, especially the tracking Gantt, if you have saved that baseline. Scheduled variance, tracking tables, and then some of the new reports. Critical tasks, late tasks, slipping tasks, and we'll look at all of those. So now let me switch over to project. So here's the project plan that you all have on your computers that I distributed earlier if you want to follow along. So this is just one of the practice files from the project step-by-step, but it has some, well, let's take a look at it. As we can see, it has some completed tasks, and it has some as yet unscheduled tasks. I'm going to just jump right into the project information dialog box. I want to point out the status date. This scenario is still set in the future, so that status date is important in terms of some of the things we'll look at tonight. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and jump into project statistics, since I mentioned that. So probably most everyone here is familiar with this. The time-related things that we're most interested in that are captured here, this is at the project level. Of course, all of my start and finish values, this plan, of course, does have a baseline. It has no actual finish date because the project is still underway, so it has uncompleted tasks in it. It does have some variance, as you can see. And then my duration, work, and cost values. Now, it's not called out explicitly here, but look at that, duration, work, and cost. Where were we just talking about? Those three attributes, right? There it is. These are those things I can quantify, model, and measure in project, and there is project doing that, right? And then finally, this is always a really interesting one, the percent complete values. I'm 49% through the duration of my project, yet I'm 53% complete of the planned work. Now, when you start looking at duration and work in this fashion, that may lead you into really powerful systems like earned value analysis. That is essentially what earned value analysis is comparing. Have I gotten the value of the work that has been completed that I have paid for at this point in the project? But you can always look at those two, and if they're really divergent, you may have a significant issue going on. If they're pretty close together, that may be a good sign. Now, it all depends on the distribution pattern of work throughout the duration of your project. This project happens to have a fairly typical sort of equal distribution or bell curve distribution of work, but many projects by their nature are heavily front-loaded or back-loaded or have some other pattern of work distribution. And you need to understand that to really evaluate, hey, are these two values, should they be that close together or not? So I'm going to begin with some activities. These happen to be from chapter 16, which is the chapter of our book that focuses on getting your project back on track. In fact, that's the name of the chapter, I believe. And we broke it into time, cost, and scope problems. We separated them very intentionally. Realistically, if you have time problems, you probably also have cost problems, and you may also have scope of work problems. You might think of them holistically, but the way you troubleshoot them might be more granular. I'm going to focus first on my time problems or my cost problems or so on. Well, these are some of the new reports in Project 2013, and we'll take a look at those.
Slipping, is that an indication of moving towards late?
Well, let's go ahead and take a look at them. So let's see. Here's the late tasks report. Now, I should say this plan may not have the right data in it for these reports to actually generate with them. This one happens not to pull up any data, so it's not particularly useful. Let's see how slipping tasks does. Okay, we got a little bit more going on here. So if you've never seen them before, these are some examples of the new reports in Project 2013. Gone are the old sort of database-centric tabular reports. These are highly graphical. These are highly customizable. I actually gave a demo here several months ago on customizing reports, and we cover it pretty extensively in the book. So the thing to understand about all of the reports in Project 2013 is they're just drawing from the same body of data. They just do a better job of letting you visualize and rearrange some of that data. So as in earlier versions, these reports are not data entry environments, they're just data viewing environments. I can't manipulate the data here directly and affect the underlying project plan. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the features that focus on time. So we mentioned the timeline in the Gantt chart. This particular plan, I don't think has a populated timeline, but we're familiar with that feature. You know, if I wanted to populate it, it's on here, add to timeline. You know, I think we've all seen this feature before. I mentioned the project summary task. This one, a little bit difficult to find. It's actually over here, Gantt chart tools. This is the contextual tab, the format tab. While I have a Gantt chart selected, it's right there, project summary task. I never think to look for it there. I always, and I've been looking at Project 2013 since it was created. Every single time I go to the project tab because it's the project summary task. But no, I'm changing the formatting of the Gantt chart view by including the project summary task. It's just one of those weird UI things, but there it is.
Is this still in preferences as well? Remember it was under tools options?
It might be. I don't recall if it's a preferences setting where I can say always on. Yeah, it seems like it ought to be.
Right, it was.
Yeah, it probably still is. Then. So Bill thinks it's a tools options preferences thing that we could set. And I ought
One
to.
call out is that level 0 is always the name of the file, just a reminder.
Yeah.
Whatever you name your project file.
Oh, right. That's a good point. Yeah, so we can see here, my task 0 name is the name of the MPP file. Yeah, and so I can't give it some other name here, which is fine. The duration value, of course, that's the overall project duration, the difference between my start date and finish date. And if you drag this over, you see there are some other useful fields that aren't visible by default. So remember that divider bar here, and you just position that where you can see other things. Now we're focused on time, so I'm going to look at some other tables. Now remember the Gantt chart view consists of the graphical chart on the right and then a table on the left. And I'm going to go view other tables. So think of it on that way. It's on the view tab. And these are all the tables that would apply to this type of a view, which is called a task view. There are other tables that apply to resource views, and we'll look at some of those too. But since we've been talking about time-related things, let's look, for example, at the schedule table. And just so we have some data in front of us, I'm going to scroll here. So here I can see some Slack. We know Slack has a very specific meaning in project. There's that start, finish, late start, late finish. We were just looking at the what was it, slipping tasks and late tasks reports. Let's look at the tracking table. Now this, in the regular Gantt chart view, not as useful. We'll switch to the tracking Gantt shortly, and then it really makes more sense. But here we can see many of the essential time-related values per task, and of course rolled up per summary task, and then rolled up in total for the project summary task as well, actual remaining duration and so on. Now I mentioned the tracking Gantt. Let's go ahead and flip over to that. There it is. And here's a shortcut for switching tables quickly. Just right-click in the upper left corner. So in Excel, that's the Select All button. It actually is in Project as well, although oddly, it's also a shortcut for picking a different table. It's pretty handy. I'll switch to the tracking table in the tracking Gantt view. Now we mentioned baseline earlier, and of course, here I'm seeing my baseline values and my historical completed task values, and then my as scheduled future values. I'm seeing 3 different types of values here. In the Gantt chart view, the lower segment of the bar is the baseline value, and then in this case, for these completed tasks, it's a darker blue, and then at this point we reach work that has not yet been completed, and it's sort of to me it looks sort of a pinkish color. So I can very quickly see where variance started cropping up in this plan pretty early in the plan, and then I carried that variance forward, and then things really blew up here on this task, and I have a considerable variance going forward. I don't know what caused the variance. The project can't answer that for me, but it's quite evident here. I then switched tables. So a Gantt always has some table, and by default it's the entry table. But there are many other tables, and they just contain different fields, right? So you pick the table that has the fields that you're most interested in. There you go, yeah. And one thing that Tim has mentioned frequently to me is he has seen people do heavy customization in project, just rearranging fields, dropping fields into a custom table, and they're essentially recreating many of the built-in tables. So browse around on the built-in tables. Chances are that combination of fields that you're most interested in for either tasks or resources already exists. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. We talked about there's some other tables I'll mention. Variance table. This is especially relevant if I have saved that baseline and I really want to get that fine detail. Now, I mentioned filtering and sorting. Those are all available here, and it's sort of the Excel style autofilter interface. I'm actually going to use that more when we switch to resource views. I can apply all of them here, but I think it makes more sense on resource views. Now, if you do, for whatever reason, you do some sorting, you say, hey, I want to, look at this, say, on, let's say finish variance. That might be a good thing. Sort largest to smallest, and you think, okay, that's interesting, but gosh, now look at my task sequence. All you ever need to do is go back to the View tab, sort by ID. In the drop-down list, it's very easy to sort or filter your table in interesting ways, but that same drop-down list doesn't have a get me back to my sort by ID. And in fact, the only place you'll find that is here on the View tab, Data Group, Sort Command, Sort by ID. Really important to know that. Otherwise, you end up with a weird representation. You haven't changed the underlying data, you're just changing the presentation of that data. Okay, are there any other major areas of time-related features that folks want to dive into? If not, I'll move on to the cost-related views.
Carl, are you going to cover the timeline view?
Yeah, I popped it up briefly here, and it's on the View tab, which makes more sense to me. Timeline. I haven't populated this one, but super useful feature. I do a lot of populating of timeline views, and then I'll just take a screenshot just of that portion. You put it in email or whatnot. In my environment where I work, I used to see a lot of timelines that were built in Visio, and there's this sort of funky tubular-looking timeline thing that my engineers seem to prefer. And I always note now when I see a project-based timeline instead of that funky Visio timeline, because I think, there's a little bit of success. Because this, of course, is populated from a real schedule, unlike Visio, which is a diagram. A little bit of happiness every time I see that. Take it where you can find it. Okay, so this project plan happens not to have a very interesting timeline, so I have it hidden by default. But it's actually on by default now. The default view when you start project is actually called Gantt chart with timeline, but that one didn't have anything on it, so I didn't focus on it. There are some other interesting views like the team planner and so on that certainly have a partial focus on time, but I think we've covered the essential views here, and again, the value of the data I see will depend a great deal on have I saved a baseline? Have I basically practiced, good techniques in the way I sequenced my activities? We talked about avoiding constraints where they're not necessary, things like that. Oh, one other feature I mentioned earlier, which I do want to demo here, is here we go. So when you're working in a timeline-centric view like the Gantt chart, very useful to be able to adjust the scale of it. And one way you can do that here is on the time scale, where I can just pick the increment of time. There's also zoom buttons right here on the status bar. Sometimes you end up with kind of funky time increments that way. So I usually end up just going here. Like here I got into, okay, this is daily, but if I were to zoom in days, I never quite understand the logic it's following. So I usually just will manually set it to what I want here. There's a task here. And I'm actually going back to the entry table. There's a task here. We can see a little indicator, and that is a deadline. So very useful feature. I don't see it used as much as I would expect, given how awesome the feature is. One reason is it's kind of buried. It's in the Advanced tab of the Task Information dialog box. This is where you set a deadline on a task, and it's a non-binding, just a little reminder. It's like, you know, a little virtual scribble you write on the schedule. Hey, I'd really like this to finish on May 29th. But here's the key. This has no effect on the scheduling engine. Zero, which is great. I mean, this is what we want instead of applying, let's say, a must finish on constraint of May 29th, which has a dramatic effect on the scheduling engine in project. Now, it's really a visual indicator, and this is a historical, so this is already passed, but here was the baseline. It's actually a milestone task too, but yeah, here's the indicator for the deadline. If I hover over that, I'll get the detail of it, name of the task, and then its deadline value. And it actually did finish prior to its deadline. And I think later in the plan, I have another task that also includes a deadline. Yeah, right there. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So, oh, by the way, what I'm doing here, there's a super nifty way of just dropping in a column or a field. I can just start typing the name of the field if I happen to know it. And now I've got the deadline field. Now, nearly all of these tasks do not have a deadline value, but this one does, and we can see it very easily here. This would be a case if I wanted to say, just filter this, like, hey, what tasks actually have deadlines applied? I can use the drop down. It might actually be kind of useful with this kind of time sequencing as well. What tasks have deadlines this month or this year? You know, that's all available too.
And you can do a window too, right?
That's right. I can set a time window. Yeah. So the filtering actually has some uses here as well. So this deadline, we can see my variance has caused the task as scheduled to actually not even start before the finish date deadline I had hoped it would meet. So that's an area where I might want to do some investigation if that deadline really matters. Now, the other thing I always recommend when adding deadlines to plans is if it's not obvious why a task has a given deadline, you can document that in a task note. Just a little explanation. You know, I set a deadline for October 12th, 2015 because of such and such. And that's good practice.
Is that indicator right there? Is that as you pass the deadline, the red?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll get, in the indicators column, I will get a graphical little alert, the little, you know, red diamond exclamation point telling me that the task has gone past its deadline. And in the previous task, because it was historical, I don't think once the task is completed and it's historical data, project basically says, I'm not going to give you that alert because you can't do anything about it now, it's historical, it's past. But for upcoming or as scheduled tasks, yes, it will pop up that. So that's another thing I can visually just keep an eye on as well. Yeah. Unfortunately, you can't filter on indicators like that, which has always been sort of puzzling to me. But, you can see them, but that's all you can do with them.
Carl, there's no filtering or anything you can do with that information, right?
The indicators column?
The indicator, sir?
To my knowledge, no. None at all. No, it's just
You can't create views around it. You can't really do much of it.
not that I know of. I mean, it's a
There's no
field.
way to solve your problem. Right?
For some things, yeah. I mean, the main things that pop up here are the very handy constraints that have been applied. That's always handy. Over allocated resource, missed deadline. Those are all useful things, you know. But again, you have to visually, yeah. Hyperlinks, notes. Those show up here as well. Line 44. This is a task that has a task calendar applied, which is another time-related thing. So Tim and I were actually just talking about this very issue because it's one of those weird things in the scenario we use in our book where it's pretty contrived, and I had to come up with a reason. Why would I apply a task calendar to this? And I said, hey, there's this service that only takes new work on Mondays through Wednesdays, and so our handoff to that service must be on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Aha, I'm going to create a task calendar. So that task can only occur on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. That was sort of the logic behind it. And Tim, you know, being a good co-author, pointed out that seems pretty contrived. And I said, no, it makes perfect sense to me. And then sure enough, we got some reader feedback. That's stupid. Why'd you do it that way? You know, yeah. And so I have to go write up an errata thing. Like, hey, it sounded good at the time. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, but that's what that is. It's a task calendar. But what I'm really saying is this kind of work, I don't want it to occur on a specific date, but I want it to occur on just certain days of the week. But I don't know or necessarily care what week it may be, but for that week it has to be a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. That was the thinking. Really, the only scenario I can think of where a task calendar is the answer. But I'm sure there are many of those. It just doesn't come up in very often.